Aloha. We are, oh, you are joining the Looking to the Future Sustainability Planning That Work session. We're going to get started in about a minute. Aloha. You are joining the Looking to the Future Sustainability Planning That Works session. We're going to get started right now. Hi, Monica. Welcome. Welcome. So before we get started, again, I'm sure you folks are more acquainted with the session's homepage, but I want to just sort of orient you if maybe this is your first section. Hi, Allison. Um, so right here you can see on the left-hand side, well, I'm sorry, on the left-hand side, there's the title of this session. You see a picture of me. On the right-hand side, you'll see a tab that says chat, polls, files, and people. Hi, Mandy. So if you go to the chat, you can go ahead and say hi to everybody. Let us know you're here, where you're zooming in from. Also, we're gonna have, because it's just me and you guys today, I wanted to make it a little bit more interactive. So we're gonna have a bunch of polls for you to participate in. So you wanna make sure you're clicking on the tab, as well as there are also, there's a Q&A tab in the poll section where you can go ahead and ask questions. And I will be sort of taking a breather through this session in order to see if there's any questions. And then the people are the people that are joining this presentation. Additionally, if you haven't participated towards the end of the session, or maybe you might have to leave a little early, there is a 5-star rate this session poll in the poll tab. So please, if you have to leave early, please make sure that you um, go scroll and find that little star poll, and go ahead and rate this session. That really gives us some great feedback, so we can know sort of what sessions are resonating with you, and that to just sort of check our work and make sure we're giving you content that's really important to you. So let's get rolling. Aloha, I'm Olani Lilly. I am a member of the OIE Technical Assistance Team. I am zooming in from Hilo, Hawaii on the Big Island, in the state of Hawaii. Have been involved in Hawaiian language immersion and culture-based education for the past 25 plus years. And it's just an amazing opportunity for me to work on this team and to be able to work with Native people from Turtle Island. And so I'm really, really excited to be here and share. And really, sustainability as it relates to both program and organizational sustainability is really where I love to play, really, to tell you the truth. But before we get started, let's go ahead and get disclaimed.
This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred.
Okay.
This
Oh, now that we got disclaimed, let's move on to what our session objectives are. We're really going to focus on developing an understanding of program sustainability, as well as learning strategies to continue your project after your grant funding ends. We're going to talk about what is program sustainability, uh, how do you put together a sustainability planning team, how to figure out what do you need to sustain, and then how you will sustain those things, and then developing an action plan that really can sort of set your feet to the ground and help you to move forward. So we're going to take our first poll. So let's move over to that poll tab um, next to the chat. Click there, and our first poll should be popping up. Now, I know some of you may have multiple grants through OIE, and so just get in your mind maybe your most primary grant funding, and let me know what year of funding you are currently in as it relates to that particular grant. Are you in your first year, maybe one of the middle years, or in your final year? Oh, wow, we got a lot of people in their final year. And then a sort of, oh, wait, no, it's moving. That poll is moving. I lied. So it looks like we got 45% are in one of the middle years. It's remaining at 50%, with about 20 to 30% in the first and 25% in the final year. Great. So great that you first year people are coming in to start to think about and plan out sustainability prior to. It's awesome that a lot of you are in your middle years and are already thinking about sustaining your program past the grant year. And then again, for final year, it's never too late to start to think about sustainability, whether it relates to this particular program or your overall program in general. Thank you for sharing. So, what is program sustainability? Well, most of you are familiar with the concept of sustainability, whether it's saving our plastics or making sure that we are separating our rubbish. You may not have engaged in sustainability planning when it comes to your actual programming before. So we want to specifically respect to your current OIE grant. Today we will delve into how to plan for sustainability, whether you are in your final year or funding or just starting out. So these are all aspects of program sustainability, is to really maintain or endure what's working well within your organization, have the ability to maintain programming as it benefits over time, as well as what happens after grant funding. Often, when people think about sustaining a grant, they go immediately to their full grant award amount of how much they currently receive through a grant and leap into thinking about how they can come up with the same amount of money. Well, of course, this may seem very overwhelming to have to come up with maybe $1 million or three to $400,000 within the next year or within maybe 2 or 3 years. That's why we need to really dig deeper into what sustainability means and what it will look like for you. Sustainability can and will look different for each of you. It may be that you want to maintain your program activities just as they are now, or you may want to continue with planned program growth, such as adding the next grade level each year, or it may be a more global goal to continue to help develop students' growth in their language learning or in their cultural learning. You may also want to address the goal in a different program model. So you might be wanting to make sure that the partnerships that you fostered through this grant can continue beyond the grant funding. Or sustainability might look like specific policies maybe you are able to put in place, such as Native students receiving an opportunity to engage in language learning to remain intact, which may or may not mean the continuation of your program. Often, your sustainability goals and outcomes will be a mixture of these. We'll walk through exactly how to determine what your sustainability can and should look like. We're going to take another poll. This will give me some insight into where you folks are at. So these are different stages of sustainability planning. The level one, you have not begun planning for sustainability. Level two, you have begun some initial sustainability planning and conversations, maybe in the thinking and conversation stage. Level three, you have begun to put a sustainability plan into place. Level four, you have made substantial progress towards sustainability. And level five, you have a solid plan and progress towards sustainability. And maybe you've actually been implementing that over the years. So why don't we go ahead and take that poll? Let me know where you are as it relates to levels one, two, three, four, and five. Go ahead and vote. I really want to make sure that I emphasize that there's not a wrong or right place to be in planning right now. The right place to be in planning right now, whatever level you're at, is that you're here and you're thinking about putting into action and learning new ideas around and maybe remembering old ideas that you had already heard about into play after today. So it looks like, oh, great. We've got, a majority of our people have begun initial sustainability planning conversations. That is awesome. Really kudos to you. 24% have not begun planning. So this is great. It'll provide you a basis to start that whole process. Again, thank you for sharing. Oh, where am I? Let me move my cursor over. So, one of the first things you want to think about is who needs to be involved in sustainability planning. And oftentimes, we want to create a sustainability planning team. Before we get too far in thinking about it, we need to think about who is going to help us develop this plan. Like with many project components, it can be easy to think that you have to dive into this all alone, but you don't. You really need to think about who you need to include in this conversation and in planning as well as in the work. As you determine who you need to include in this planning team, remember to include both internal and external stakeholders. If you currently use an advisory or program planning team, committee, or team, they're a great place to start. They already are highly engaged and they have a wonderful working knowledge of your program. They can help you think through um, program pieces that are working and maybe areas of expansion. Um, think through what administrative members of your organization would be vital to include. Often you will need input and decision making abilities to ensure the success of your plan. Finally, think about staff members who are integral to the successful implementation of your program. These staff members are vital to your sustainability planning. Some of these may include uh, your fiscal person, administration, definitely your program director, maybe again your advisory team, your maybe if you're a nonprofit, creating a committee on your board, as well as staff members, both from the program implementation piece all the way to administration. And when you talk about external members, individuals with funding or knowledge, community knowledge. So when we talk about individuals with funding, it's really helpful to maybe bring in or have a member, maybe a professional fundraiser, be a volunteer member on this team, as well as maybe your grant writer if that person is housed in another part or another department of your organization. Uh, Current community partners are really key to be a part of this team. Also, community members and individuals with influence. Now, some of these external members may sort of ebb and flow in and out of this planning team, but including them will really provide a broad, not only just help in developing the plan, but further on, they may actually become champions in the actual implementation of this plan. It can also help to think about the roles or skills you need on your sustainability team, and not just the specific categories of people. Who are other people, roles, or skills you want to include on your sustainability planning team? You could go ahead and maybe share in the chat um, some skills, some roles you think that may be important to have on your planning team. My role within the larger organization gives me insight into how this program fits within our strategic plan and larger organization. That's always great. Sometimes program implementers are not on the daily connected to the larger goals of the organization. So having someone there to continue to tie back actual program implementation to the strategic plan is really helpful. Helping to launch this program, people know that they have the historical information from putting programs on the ground and then watching them grow, and have information about what worked and what didn't. So those are key, again, skills that should be considered on your planning team. Another skill, or practice or experience, is to someone that implemented program day by day. That's what I call the on the ground person, and can provide uh, important insight into what is feasible. So again, if we're sitting in an administrative group and we're talking about, we can maybe not have to go to this site, and that will decrease costs as far as transportation and supervision of students. That site might be very influential and be the base of the program. So we really want to have that input from someone in our team. Now that you have a strong team to help you, it's time to get to the nitty gritty of sustainability planning. Deciding what you are going to sustain and how you're going to do that. These may seem like straightforward questions, but there are a lot of important considerations to each one: the what and the how. Before you get to even answering those questions, it's helpful to gather planning documents that you're going to need to develop and answer some of these questions. Having your mission and vision statements there, program budgets, including all current funding sources, any MOUs or contracts with partners, definitely strategic planning documents. That strategic plan is really your guardrails on this sustainability plan, and really influence where and when you're going to be investing in with your resources. And then also program evaluations, any kind of program evaluations, which also can include perspective surveys from partners, um, students, families, and as well as the community. This information is really key to help guide and provide context for your planning team. Now that you have some important data and documents together, it's time to consider how two important questions: what you need to sustain and what you want to sustain. It's kind of like when I go shopping with my daughter. My daughter will say that she really wants this new dress, which I think is fabulous. But when I look at our budget and when I look at her wardrobe, what she really needs is a new pair of shoes. um, because she's going to be playing soccer. While these questions may seem similar, they're very distinct. Things you need to sustain the program activities and components that are necessary for your program to continue meeting its goals and providing benefits. While items you want help to sustain may bring great benefit to students and families, they may not be required for sustainability. So here are some examples and a sample of that. So an example is, what do we need to sustain? So we already have a kindergarten teacher. We know we need to sustain this program. We need to maintain that position. Additionally, we are using consumable language workbook. So we need to make sure that we are purchasing the same, at least the same amount for the next kindergarten class. What do you want to sustain? We would like to create a subscription to a language learning app for each student. which would allow them to maybe explore different lessons and allow them to do that utilizing technology. Additionally, we would want to provide some professional learning by sending our kindergarten teacher to a learning conference. So those are really samples of key program elements that we want to differentiate between need and want. I'm going to take a fast break and kind of move over to the chat. Oh, great! So it looks like teachers and counselors are good partners in the planning phase. That's awesome. I agree. Sometimes a reorganization of permanent staff can ensure sustainability. Yes, and we'll be getting to that as well. Administration planning director, project director, content specialist, and finance. Really good. Really good. I'm going to click over to post to see if you posted any questions. So there is, it looks like there is a question. Um, does this question mean the funding we need, or what part of the program do we need to sustain? What part of the program do we need to sustain? That's really the question right now. We'll get to what funding we need to sustain our needs. Great question. Long-term positive effect on children and families. Yes, that's a great um, uh, idea around what you need and what you want. Funds to pay for tuition, fees, books, and stipends for potential teachers. Yeah, that's a need. I guess maybe my question is that a need or is that a want? Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Again, if you have any questions, you can pop it over there. And as I take a breather, I will look over at this section. Funding to support preschool programs with rural Alaskan school districts is not currently included in state. Oh, good. So that sounds like a need um, that you need to start begin to address. Great. Thanks for sharing. Okay, so we'll move on to our next slide. It's important to take into consideration all possible program elements when determining what you need to sustain, what you want to sustain, and equally important, what do you need or want to sustain? Again, that's blending the two. Your program budget and strategic planning documents will be particularly helpful here. When do you think about personnel, be sure to include the fringe benefit costs and adjust for likely salary increases. So again, when we think back to that example around the kindergarten teacher, maybe this year she is going to be getting a salary increase as per the union agreement. And so we want to make sure when we get to the funding piece that we are increasing that cost to reflect that, as well as maybe healthcare costs are going up in our area. And so we want to make sure that the personnel cost includes the fringe benefit increases. With supplies and materials, consumable supplies are a significant ongoing expense, but you also may need additional computers and printers. And so, really, this comes into thinking about also timing and maybe also thinking about how we can create efficiencies in these areas. Will you continue to engage the services of an evaluator beyond the life of the grant? Could you possibly use them on a scale back basis? One of the strategies I used in other organizations I worked at, in particular when we were talking about consultants, was we would make it as part of our contract that they would be required to teach us how to do what they were doing. And if we had someone who was particularly passionate about data collection or evaluation in this instance, or we had someone who was particularly passionate about um, marketing and communication. And so when we hired a PR consultant to come in, we actually made it as part of her contract to teach this person who had a passion for this work how to do this. And so we were actually intentionally providing both professional development, but also looking at not having that reoccurring cost. And so really thinking about how you can develop within your organization to sort of scale back on continuing those costs. Professional development, again, often seems to be one of the first areas programs cut. But remember, your staff need to be adequately prepared and supported in their work, and developing staff is a great way to retain staff. You know, in schools, a lot of times, a new emerging model is around instructional coaches. Again, if you go out and hire a consultant to provide professional development, have them work closely with your instructional coaches so that expertise is being embedded into your organization, and you'll have that diminished reoccurring cost around professional development because you're building that into your staff. You may have completed your planned curriculum development, but will need to create an additional grade level or update existing materials. Are there consumable workbooks or other products to continue to purchase? Also, this relates to assessments as well. What is the reoccurring cost of assessment development? And also, again, like I said, the reoccurring cost. Are you going to need to pay for external testers, maybe even translators? We, at one point in a school I worked with, we actually had a whole staff around testers, and that worked well because it helped our teachers. But then our teachers were really saying, you know, they felt disconnected from the assessment. And so what we did was we sort of flipped that, and we looked at the teachers actually providing tests, and then we used, when they were working one on one, maybe with a student to do a language assessment, we brought in our cultural practitioners to continue the education with the rest of the class, which helped to decrease that budget amount. Many of you have been providing amazing cultural activities and field trips as part of your program. How could you continue this? Will you need to scale back? If you currently use partners, which of them are completely in kind and which require some level of payment? Which are vital to your program and which are supplementary? What could be negotiated? Most of you are taking indirect costs, which typically go toward a number of infrastructural expenses. After grant funding, will you be responsible for any space or utility fees, transportation, technology, or insurance that you'll have to make sure you include in this sustainable plan? Finally, as you examine each consideration, also think about your ongoing expense versus your startup expense. Many of your startup expenses have been covered by the grant funding, which will allow you to operate at a lower overall budget after the grant. However, if you plan to expand programming after the grant or even each year, you will continue to incur some sort of startup costs as you plan to scale up your grade levels. We're going to go take a quick poll over again. So you can go over to the poll tab, and under what do you want to sustain? So there's actually two polls to this. In the first poll, I would like you to share what you want to sustain. And in the second poll is what you need to sustain. So let's go ahead and take the first poll. Looks like people are putting it in already. You guys are so on it. Oh, and the needs. I see. I hadn't scrolled all the way to the top. Sorry about that. And so funding for students that are no longer on track or to graduation. That's amazing. That seems like that's a need for your organization. What you want. So we can see some of the wants that programs want to sustain. Our internship and apprenticeship that you've developed through the NYCP grant, funded for continued capacity building for our TEA, teacher training programs, that's great. Partnerships, induction services. Oh, so the current operating of preschool programs, cultural activities in college. Awesome. So you're sort of all hitting on those key components that we had talked about earlier. Great. Thank you for sharing. Awesome. Now let's take this one step further and look at our long-term sustainability. So now we've gone from looking at a year to a longer span to maybe 3 years. While our focus right now, like I said, is maybe on next year, we need to start thinking ahead. I know that none of you want to sustain your program for only 1 year. You're all looking for long running, high quality native programs. This means you really need to look beyond 1 year from the start. For today, we'll focus on the next 3 years, but you want to expand your plan to 5 years. And really, that 5 years means you're working, it's sort of like a mountain. You're working up the mountain to gain that goal. And then as you're going down, the next 3, 4, 5, year 5, you're really starting to gear up for the next up the mountain, to be able to sustain your programs beyond those 5 years. As we think about the items that we need and want to sustain, how might that change over the next 3 years? Are there want items that may become need items as time progresses? Will our overall needs increase or decrease? Let's check out our example. You see that our staffing needs increase if we plan to add one grade level of programming each year. Not only are we increasing our demand on workbooks, but also basically is on the number of teachers. It's important to remember that the number of students served each year will be increasing. And so you want to make sure you're increasing your consumable supplies of workbooks. You'll also notice that professional learning moved as a necessity into year 2, as this program determined that they needed this level of training at least every other year, whereas the language learning app remained a bonus add each year if possible. You'll want to sit down with your planning team and really map this out, your wants and needs for at least the next 3 years to ensure that you are prepared fully. Now we get to sort of what is the price tag. And I know that's really getting to the heart of some of the comments and concerns you're bringing up in the chat and in the polls around actually finding the funding. But before you go to find and look for grants, really need to know what amount you're looking for. So let's look back at our initial example to look at the price tag and how much each cost is in general. Remember that this is just an initial brainstorm, and we need to remember to think long term. So again, this is like our 1 year plan. So if we're going to continue to we need to have a kindergarten teacher. That's the minimum that we need. That's her salary plus fringe and benefits. We also need to purchase the workbooks for for the next kindergarten class. This is how we priced it out per workbook per student. And then we've also priced out the subscription to a language learning app, as well as registration and travel to professional development. I want you to just maybe keep in mind and look at the cost of the consumable workbook versus the cost of the app. And just keep that in the back of your head as we move forward. Now, when we look into the future beyond that 1 year, we really want to uh, see how this funding and the price tag changes. This may cause you to adjust your thinking on some wants versus needs, or possibly adjust your timeline for certain components. Most important, this gives you a clear picture of the activities and components that you must sustain, plus the amount of money that you must get to sustain them and raise that money. No matter what this funding price tag comes to, it is most likely less than your current grant award. Remember those overwhelming large numbers from the beginning? We need to sort of take that into consideration. As we start thinking about how of sustainability, you will also start to see why it is so important that you understand the cost of each activity or component that you plan to sustain. And that again takes us back to looking at those documents that we gathered and having those program budgets available. So let's take a look at this. So in year one, we're sustaining that kindergarten teacher as well as the uh, workbook for each student in the kindergarten class. In year two, we are adding on a first grade teacher. So you can see that salary, that personnel amount go up, as well as the consumable workbooks go up to 700. And they're also adding in the registration because, again, the program felt it was valuable to do training and professional development every other year. When we look at year three, we're actually again increasing to another grade level. So not only do we have to increase the second grade level, but we also have to maintain the first grade personnel as well as the cost of the kindergarten. So you can see again that a personnel cost as well as the consumable language book um, cost per student. So it's not just 35 students at each grade level, but it's for the students for kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. Then when we look at the want side, we have the registration for the app, or I'm sorry, the registration for travel in the first year for professional development, as well as the registration for and the cost for the app. In the second year, you can see that app um, increasing to reflect the number of students, the increase in the number of students in the second year. The other thing is that in year three, you see that registration um, for professional development increases because this is our every other year. We want to make sure that we have that as a want, and we are providing it for all of the staff now on board, as well as a subscription for all of our students. Now that we have a good idea of what you want, you must sustain those needs and what you would like to sustain the wants, it's time to start thinking about the how. So before we get again into looking at what funding is out there, what we want to do is assess what our current funding resources are. Where do we currently receive money from for our program? Remember to think that we want to think about all of the funding sources included, including those that are in kind. So as you can see, we have different categories here. We have the federal, state, local, private, and in kind. Now, the local may include also your tribal organizations. So let's look at our first example. This is probably a common scenario for many grantees. Uh, you may be receiving a majority of your support through an actual Fed grant. And in this example, it's a null grant with received 350,000 per year. There are restrictions per the grant proposal. It ends it's 2020, which should be 2021. And we also have the potential to reapply. We have no funding coming from our state or local or even private categories. And we have some in kind coming in, which is basically that the state school district is is covering our facility and usage um, of utilities. And right now in the contract, it's an ongoing agreement. So here's another example of a more diversified funding structure. What you notice is that they have leveraged funding from a tribe as well as a private foundation. Note that some that each funding source may come with a variety of restrictions on the money, such as what types of activities it can be used for or what ages of students can be served. This is where knowing exactly how much each of your program activities or components cost really comes in handy. You can start matching up available funds with allowable expenses. Also, each of these funding streams may have different lengths of funding and ability to reapply, or may be subject to political or even community support. So, all of those things need to be taken into consideration. So, if we took that last funding plan, this is how we could sort of graph out and look at our diversity. And actually, sorry, I'm referring to this pie. That pie takes into consideration this actual example. So as you can see here, over 75% of the funding coming for this program is from one federal source. We also have some in kind, and that again is the school facility amount. That's the next highest. We have some private money. Again, one was a local foundation. And then the local money, which was the tribal funds. And so you can see we're very heavy on our federal funding. And usually, what you want to do, this may seem a little scary, and what you want to do is really diversify. The more you can even out these pie pieces, the more you can create some financially stable program. What funding resources have you used beyond your OIE grant funds? So right now, if you could, sorry, we're gonna go to the polls section again. Now you don't need to share the actual name of the funder or the funding source. You could just say federal, state, maybe tribal, um, maybe local or individual donor. You can go to that poll at the top of your page and go ahead and write in your responses, and a word cloud should begin to pop up. Oh, okay. Looks like it's a listing. Sorry about that. I thought it was a word cloud. Looks like we're getting a lot of federal, some local, general funding. We are seeking private partnerships and foundational funding. Awesome. We're also earmarked for TriMark. That is great. The more that you could sort of uh, look and search out earmarking of funding, that provides your program some level of stability. And it's also a really great tool to leverage in funding sources. Other foundations are eager to jump on if they know they don't have to take up a lion's share, or they're not the lion's share of your funding. And so having earmarked funds um, is really helpful, whether it's through tribal, maybe it's a charter school and you're receiving state or local funding. But finding even a university is also a good source. Um, and there are some larger foundations that will actually also um, look at adopting your organization and earmarking you for a longer period of time. Great. Thank you again for sharing. Okay, I'm going to take a moment and take a look if we have any questions. Okay, no questions there. And I'm going to go hop over to the chat. Oh, yes. Thanks, Allison, for reminding me. Um, for those of you, a lot of these sustainability tools are in your planners that were created by Sarah. And there is a grid of sustainability resources in this planner. So that's actually where a lot of these tools are coming from. So thanks for reminding me, Allison. Okay. So now we're getting more into the nitty gritty. We're going to be looking at where are our gaps. So you've identified what you need and want to sustain, the cost associated with each of these pieces, and your current funding availability. Now it's time to look at your funding gaps. Depending again on what year the grant you're currently in, will depend on whether you are including OIE funds or not in determining your gaps. This is why sustainability planning is so crucial to your organization. Best case scenario, your OIE funding is a part of an ongoing sustainability plan. Next base case scenario is that you began a sustainability plan when you applied for OIE funding. If OIE funding is ending soon, when many of you may want to be looking at reapplying, it is impossible to know who will receive a second grant. So really take that into consideration and start planning as soon as possible for not having those funds, so you won't be surprised. So as you can see here, what we're really looking at are the different program components. Again, personnel, you know, co- consumable costs, travel, transportation, all of the costs we have gone through before, looking at year one, year two, and year three of what is current right now and what you anticipate. Um, well, actually, what is current, sorry. So let's look at a sample of a plan around looking at our gaps. And so what we see right here is that in year one, we have already in our personnel, we have a gap of 32,000. And then we look across as we continue to build with the current funding that we are planning out, we continue to have a deficit in that area. We look at consumable costs. That is definitely a gap area we need to fill across all 3 years, as well as the Learn Language app and professional conference. Where we do have a surplus is in our local cultural activities, and that potentially came from our foundation grant that we may have received. So this is really where we look at how what kind of funding we need to get and where we're getting it from, which leads us into matching our gap needs to potential funding resources. And so, again, when we looked at those different areas of funding that we currently have, we also want to look at them as it relates to potential funding resources. So, for federal funding, some of these may include block grants or even discretionary grants, like the OIE grants, or maybe you've applied for an administration for Native American grants, maybe another Department of Education grants. There's also some funding in USDA for rural community um, training, that could be for teacher training or even looking at small business development. State funding, maybe there's some, your state has general funds. If you are, like, for example, a charter school, you may be receiving general funds through your state Department of Education, as well as grants. Some of these grants come from actual like departments, whether it's Department of Health and Human Services. There are a lot of states that have funding that are coming from federal sources to do after school programming, to do resiliency planning and resiliency programming, as well as youth development, which some of your programs may definitely fall into. Additionally, some grants, I don't know about all of your states, but some grants and legislators actually provide grant funding. We have a grant and aid program that you can submit through your local legislator to be uh, allocated into what they call a CIP, or GIA grant and aid fund through your state legislator. In And then we have local funding, which, and again, in the example you saw, were tribal money. Also, you can go, maybe you have county provides grants, and even maybe your local governments. Um, this, I don't know about you folks, but in my state, a lot of the COVID funds went from federal to state to actually local counties, in order to access and get the money out into community. And so you want to make sure you're connecting to your local county governments as well. And then there's private funding. This can include independent foundations, company sponsored foundations, community foundations, as well as individual donors. So, there's both national independent foundations as well as like community foundations. There are national foundations like the Cresby Foundation. Um, there are company sponsored foundations, like Walmart. A big one that came out was, I don't know if you have them, but is Spectrum, particularly with COVID, is a lot getting into rural communities and into communities that lacked access to internet because being able to connect became a really big thing. That was a funder that really sort of stepped up to the plate regarding that, as well as a community foundation. So you may have small, we have a Hawaii Community Foundation that really sort of brings together both individual donors that create actual foundations, as well as pools of donors that can create grant opportunities. And then, an area that we really need as Native people to spend time in, and a lot of us don't, is around developing individual donors. This actually, when you look at fund development and you look at a pyramid, some of the most sustainable donors and funding sources are individuals. The people who your mission and what you're doing really resonates with them, and they will create. Maybe they'll come in and maybe buy a ticket to an event that you're having, and over the years you cultivate a relationship, all the way to the potential of them bequeathing part of their will to your actual organization and be able to stabilize some of your funding. There are also in-kind sources of funding, like for example, maybe a partner that you are sharing office space with, or kitchen space, or program space. So, for example, we have a large school, which is also a foundation that's a large landowner, and we partnered with them to utilize their actual learning sites, their actual environmental sites as learning sites. And so we calculated in that donation as in kind. Other is to potentially generate income and or charge fees. Remember, you need to make sure if you are doing that, that you are speaking with your fiscal people to make sure that your taxes and everything fall into line. Um, and you are aware of the percentage around generating funds. And then actual fundraising, holding fundraising events. A lot of times when you think about fundraising, uh, most of us think about those dinners and people buying tables and corporate sponsors of tables, and that's a great way. The goal of that is to raise money, yes, but the bigger goal is to raise friends. And you really want to begin to cultivate those individual donors that will be so touched by the stories and by your impact that they'll want to give year after year and hopefully increasing. So let's take a moment to kind of go over to our polls. We have another poll here. Um, are there, just sort of want to get an idea before I move on, are there any particular funding resource categories that you would like to learn more about? So you can go ahead if you want to learn more about federal funding, state funding, local, any of these categories. Awesome. So it looks like, oh, it looks like we're about tied as far as federal, state, and local funding goes, but that's changing. Awesome. Private funding, in-kind funding, and then fundraising. It's interesting that you see like the top four are around funding, and a lot of this funding is through like applications and sort of your standard. We get really good. I know a lot of Native communities get really good at grant writing, and we feel very comfortable with that. The task of moving from grant writing and asking through a paper to asking somebody face to face is a little bit of a struggle, but it's definitely time well spent, particularly if you look at the idea that you're not raising money, you're raising friends and community. Thank you for participating in that uh, poll. It does look like a lot of people, 14%, are interested in generating income. That's great. Let me move forward. One of the key things and one of the reasons why we've done all this work prior to is to get to a place where we're not chasing the money. It becomes so enticing, particularly when we're just looking at grants and reading grants at face value, to try to either change where our program is going or try to contort maybe some of our strategic plans, our goals, and our objectives. Really, when you think about raising funds as raising relationships from a native and also a fundraising standpoint, what you want to do is really maintain that relationship. And so you want to really communicate as you're developing that the heart, the mission, the vision, and the impact of that organization. And really at the grant moment or the meeting the person and cueing them into what you're doing, that's really where you want to you know get people, and make sure that it's a right fit for both you as well as the funder. That's really where you start to believe, develop a relationship. I once had a grant that I had actually gone and chased the money. And fortunately, we had someone on the grant selection committee. This was through a foundation that actually knew the heart of our organization and actually believed in the heart organization. And so after reviewing that application, they called me and said, Eleni, we saw your grant proposal. It was okay, but it really didn't miss the mark. It looks like you were just sort of trying to fit your program into our funding source. And because I know your funding, I'm going to actually send this grant to another funder who I think will be a better fit for your organization. I was so thankful for that opportunity, but it really brought to mind that it was the relationship that mattered and their knowledge of our program, and really me being honest about what our program was trying to achieve. And so I really want to encourage you to think about whether it's through a grant proposal or whether it's through a face-to-face ask, to think about your first step as being honest and starting that journey around building a relationship with the funding source. So now, as we look at what are your potential funding sources, we want to look at these categories and consider what funding category we want to increase. One great way to start brainstorming potential funding resources is by breaking them down into federal, state, local, private, and in kind. Some funding sources may feel like they could fit in to more than one category. For example, maybe a BIA might be coming through your state, but also might fit into federal. And that's fine. This is really just planning work, and you can place them where you see fit for now, and move them around later on. So let's go back to the the funding pie chart that we created. So on the left hand side is our sort of current funding sources. And what we notice is that there is a slice of the pie that is missing. We are not receiving any funds from any state source. So maybe one area, as we think strategically, is about spending some time around cultivating relationships and looking at opportunities as it relates to state resources. We want to look at maybe that may, if we increase and create some relationships and get some funding through our state, we might also be able to increase local, private, and also maybe reduce our in-kind funding, as well as decrease our federal funds. And so this is really maybe if we were doing a first year program. So we want to look at planning out the decrease of our federal funding and our reliance on federal funding to fund the entire program. What this strategy shows is that based on our need, we are at least able to increase by 11% in resources. This strategy shows a strategy that focuses again on increasing funds from our state government with small increases in other areas. I'm going to take a moment and see if there are any questions. Let's see, let me scroll there. Okay, none there. Let me go check out your chat. Oh, yep. Yep, Sarah's got. Thanks, Allison, for putting her email. Usually, the person who receives the planner in your organization is actually your project director. That's the person who should have. If you're receiving a funds from OIE, that's the person who will have your planner. Uh, I have a general question for tribes with casinos. Does that hamper your efforts to seek external funding? Um, when you talk about external funding, I'm going to say if you are want to look at foundations again, having a stable sort of source of funding allows like foundations and maybe even individuals to look at your funding that they don't have to come in and pay for everything. They are contributing, and so you are really leveraging that that ongoing funding source to bring in additional money to maybe in the areas of your wants. And so if you already have that funding coming in and you can, it's earmarked for you, that's a really great leveraging tool for other funding. So I don't necessarily think it hampers it. It might actually help it. But again, it depends on the actual funding source. I hope that answers your question, Allison. So we focused a lot on funding needed in order to sustain, but I do want to kind of take a moment to discuss the support needed to sustain your program. You will need support from within your school district, organization, and from within your community. For discussion purposes, we'll just unite the two into a term we call community. So, community support is necessary in order to sustain your program beyond grant funding. Your community must know about your program, believe in your program, and ideally be engaged in your program for you to secure the funding and money you will need to sustain. They really become your champions out there in the community. You know, a lot of times if you're working within the school, you're working with students, those really become your best PR people to talk about your community because they're involved in all different areas of the community and have access to spheres that maybe your grant writer or your program developer or your administrator doesn't have access to. So really harnessing that support is critical to sustaining your program. We can look at two key types of program support: community and program champions. Community support can include, like I said, parents, extended family, friends, local community boards, groups, and businesses. This can also include individual donors and people who find that your mission is aligned to their values. Program champions often are in native communities, include elders and cultural practitioners. Sometimes consultants that you're working with can also become your a valuable program champion. Turning local private foundation staff into champions is extremely valuable. They not are only able to champion your organization within sort of just their funding um, area, but they might be able to move your cause into a larger mission around equity, native education that can be extremely valuable. You know, one funder that we had was able to open doors to be able to speak to people who we as a small community organization didn't know or have connections to. And so even connecting to people who can set up a meeting for you to meet with a potential funder, or set up a meeting with you to talk to your local legislator to really sort of make that connection is very key. It may not be funding, it may just be opening that door or setting up a meeting. So let's go back to our poll. How have you built community support? So let's click here. Oh, maybe this is just in your chat. Sorry about that. So if you could just go into the chat and click on how you have been building community support. Sometimes like I said again, I just really believe that every time you go out into your organization, you have the potential of building community support and building a friend. That doesn't necessarily have to mean anything monetarily today, but they could be free PR. You know, a great parent who's had great success, their child has great success, and is so animated and talkative about it is worth more than any PR consultant, let me tell you. Oh, where's my, there we go. So now we get to action planning. And this is really where we take all of our thinking and all of our documents and we put it into boots on the ground kind of work. We really want to create a smart goal, and by now I know you folks are very versed and are smart goal experts. We want to think about what our current status is, and then really thinking about the strategies, action steps, materials that are going to be needed, timeline, and don't forget that person responsible, and making sure we kind of spread that responsibility out. So, as it relates to the budgets that we've been going through, and in particular looking at our last budget and our last strategy priority, I created this sample of SMART goal. So, as you can see, we're really focusing on that state funding, and we want to increase that by 6% through grants and contracts within the year. And one of our first strategies is my favorite, making friends, developing relationships with state legislators, and don't forget those agencies that may be coming out with grants, such as your Department of Health, your Department of Education, or even your Department of Human Services. And maybe even some, you might have a county rural agency. And then you really want to come up with those action steps. One of the first ones I like to look at is reviewing collateral materials. So, reviewing the things, the materials that I'm going to be getting and sharing as I develop my relationships with these people. So, my brochures, maybe my website, maybe, not maybe, but definitely my website, maybe a fiscal report. Um, Also, I want to look at many of my social networking platforms. I want to make sure all of that communicates the same brand and the heart of the organization and what we've been able to accomplish. You want to really look at that before you go and meet with any of these people. And then I want to set up and conduct those meetings. I want to make sure that I am getting out. You really need to look with regards to elected officials, look at when they're in session and when they're out of session. Sometimes they really don't have time to think about you during session, and so you want to carve out that time prior, and even maybe get a little creative about during election time. Now you can't participate and as an organization in fun, but you never know, you might have a parent who is helping that legislature, and so again, building those relationships, that parent may be able to open a door to an informal coffee or a visit which is great, to your actual school or organization. And then strategy number two, really, we before we get to contracting with the state agency, we need to make sure we're in compliance and all ready to go. And so I know within our state, we actually have to, nonprofit actually has to register with not just the AG, the Attorney General, but also with the state procurement office. And that really requires having all of our documents together, making sure we have our budget, organization. A lot of these departments require attending a registration training. So having all those pieces and making sure the right person is attending that, whether it's, I have here the business manager, because a lot of times with the state procurement office, it's a lot of funding information that you have to share. Here's a little checklist. We want to sort of check our plan. Is it smart? Is it based on best practices? Is it one that our entire team supports? So definitely we want to have support from our planning team, but then we also want to take this out to our larger organization. Again, I've even shared fundraising plans with parents and students, because again, they are your best PR. And if they know what's going on and they meet people, they could possibly direct a possible partner or funder back to you. And you can begin to cultivate that relationship. Is it dependent on other activities, programs, or people? Making sure that they're included. Making sure that you're assigning it to specific individuals that you can turn to be accountable for the different actions. Is it realistic and feasible? Can you get this done? And also, is it something that will lead to accomplishing your SMART goal? Making sure that those actions and strategies, as well as the timeline, are helping you to accomplish your goals. So, with 5 minutes left, again, it's been me talking all this time. I'm going to take a fast look over and see if there's any questions um, or comments. We partner. Oh, Barbara, we partner with everyone who will partner with us. I love it. Everybody's a friend, right? And we've had beautiful results. That is awesome. Again, I really want to encourage that, and that's an awesome sentiment. Everybody can be partners in serving your community. Um, if that's great, and really thinking outside of your normal sort of characters, you know. Yeah, I agree. That's a great attitude. I'm going to scroll down and check the poll, see if there's any questions. If you have to leave right now, we got a little bit. Please make sure you do the poll and rate the session. 1 star, not so great. 5 stars, it was awesome, or anywhere in between. I really want to thank you for your time and for joining this session. I hope it was helpful. I'm going to go back to share my screen because I want to sort of wrap up here with our final poll. What is one thing you'd like to learn more about with respect to sustainability? If you could just sort of let us know. Um, this will really help us understand and maybe even include in future technical assistance that we can maybe get and dive deeper into the different aspects of sustainability, maybe different funding and funding resources categories. So if you could enter that here. Again, the question is, what is one thing you'd like to learn more about with respect to sustainability? Would you like to continue working on sustainability? No thanks. You're ready to accomplish sustainability. Yes, I would like another large group webinar on sustainability. Yes, I would like to focus on sustainability as a topic in a small group. Or you want to do sustainability during your coaching calls. Again, this will help us to plan out future trainings. In the next steps, you really want to assess your current state of your planning or plan. determine what plan you're going to use to sustain what, sorry, begin determining what you plan to sustain and current resources. Reach out to your OIE team to engage in sustainability coaching, and also review this webinar with your team. What's next? So we have some great networking sessions starting in about 15 minutes. Take a break, stand up, stretch, breathe, do our breathing exercises that we practiced this morning in our keynote speak. Go to the share on the social wall, chat on the discussion board. Also, go check out the resource library. Maybe you weren't able to attend another session and you want to get some of the resources, go there. Again, I want to thank you for your time and spending time with me today. Have a glorious and wonderful day. I will see you in about 15 minutes if you are joining the native language and culture based networking session. Ahui ho, until we meet again. Aloha.